Welcome back, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving to all those who celebrate. We've had a lot of recent announcement in the UFC, a lot of stuff that, if we're being honest, most of us probably didn't see coming. I actually was planning on making this video earlier in the week, but got a little bit delayed due to Thanksgiving stuff. And while I was editing, that's when we got a lot of surprising news regarding the UFC's lightweight division as well as the UFC's featherweight division. Going in this, I really wanted to focus on who the next deserving contenders were for the UFC's welterweight and lightweight divisions following UFC Qatar. I'm still going to go in and break the cases for why those two deserving contenders should have been Armin Sarukian and Ian Machado Gary, respectively. However, I'll also make a call out to a few of the honestly absurd announcements that we've gotten recently. To get into it, to be blunt, following the changes that we saw in the UFC Qatar card, with us having Islam Makhachev be the new certified welterweight champion, as well as Ilia Topuria having retained his UFC's lightweight division title, we all expected to see a mega fight in one way or another. We thought it would have been Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev, but after we saw that Armin Sarukian pledged his case with his performance, and we assumed he would have regained his number one contendership, especially with his last fights having overcome Charles Oliveira prior to Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker himself being somebody who's beaten Mateus Gamrot, who's one of the few losses that Armin Sarukian had a couple years ago. And then especially when you look at Charles Oliveira, having been somebody who in recent history has only lost to the best of the best, meaning he's lost to Islam Makhachev, he's lost to Armin Sarukian, and then most recently he lost to Ilia Topuria. Oliveira always then goes on to perform a shutout against whoever his next opponent is. Following Ilia Topuria, we saw him shut down Mateus Gamrot, finish him real easily. Post Islam Makhachev, we saw Oliveira destroy Dariush. And then even post Armin Sarukian, we saw Oliveira go in there and put on a show against Michael Chandler, despite a lot of the dirty tactics that were being utilized against him in those fights. When we look at the quality of fighter Sarukian has been defeating, mind you, Sarukian also is the only other fighter, at least back then. Right now, I know that post Benoit Saint Denis, he's been looking, well, a lot of the narratives concerning him has shifted, but Beneil Dariush was a major hidden threat within the lightweight division, and Oliveira was the first person to actually stop that, and Sarukian was the second person to really make it look easy. Even how he started that fight against Benoit Saint Denis with those opening leg kicks, never know what could have happened if his chin just held up to that counter. However, we watch Armin Sarukian skill-wise be the best lightweight contender in that division. Sarukian has a lot of power. Sarukian has phenomenal grappling. We saw against somebody who's had so much improved takedown and grappling defense as is we saw in Dan Hooker. And even with some of those guillotines that were pretty deep, we saw Sarukian creatively like gator roll out of them. Overall, very, very impressive fighter. Due to his own fault, he's kind of fell out of favor with the UFC. We've seen the UFC really initially try to give him a lot of those opportunities to get his title shot, from initially against Islam when he was offered the shot, which he refused. And then after that, we see him once again when he was scheduled to fight Islam and then last minute pulled out, which really, really rubbed the UFC the wrong way. And while this would have been understandable in most cases, in this specific aspect, it just cannot be. Because when we look at the actual competition for contendership in the division, it was between three people. Paddy Pimblett, Justin Gaethje, and Armin Sarukian himself. We've seen Justin Gaethje at one point in time was the deserving number one contender after he defeated Dustin Poirier. That was when Gaethje won the BMF title against Poirier with that massive head kick. However, we saw Gaethje forfeit that opportunity, so to speak, when he got finished by Max Holloway in what was honestly a bit of a one-sided performance following the first after that spinning back kick. But after that, we saw Gaethje go against Fiziev, who, yes, initially that fight was supposed to be against Hooker, but it was against Fiziev, who, despite being a very skilled and fun fighter, he himself does not warrant a title shot. This very fight is an opponent that not only has Gaethje already defeated, he's an opponent that Gaethje really did always kind of overcome stylistically. Gaethje just presented a bit of too much for Fiziev, and Fiziev never was in a ranking position that would warrant jumping the line. Fiziev is not a top 5 or 6 fighter in the lightweight division. Beating him, if anything, it just defends Gaethje's ranking and position. That's what it was both times they fought. It was never a type of dominance. It was never him proving anything. It was basically just him certifying that he is who we thought he is. And who we thought he is not somebody who's currently deserving of a title opportunity. Then we have Paddy Pimblett. Paddy Pimblett, of all of these three, is probably the most untested fighter. Yes, he's an undefeated prospect. He's somebody the UFC has been trying to build for a very long time. And then especially when you watch Paddy Pimblett in his most recent performance against Michael Chandler, yeah, he looked like a world beater. But once again, we're looking at the quality of opponent. Michael Chandler is probably the best opponent he's beaten so far. Yes, we saw him beat Tony Ferguson. We saw him run through Bobby Green. Then we saw him basically one-sidedly beat down Michael Chandler. However, that Michael Chandler himself honestly hasn't proven anything except that initial performance against Dan Hooker. And that was the best opponent that Michael Chandler has beaten. Michael Chandler, despite being very skilled, has honestly been a disappointment in the UFC. Very exciting fighter to watch. He beat a very early version of Dan Hooker in the aspect of the improvements Dan Hooker has made since then. And while it was pretty impressive and we thought it had meant a lot of big things to come, but we watched him lose against all the top-rated guys. We saw him make a lot of silly mistakes. We saw his fight IQ evaporate. And then every single time when he gets an increase in competition, he fails. Since then, every increase in competition has been a failure on the part of Michael Chandler. Yes, still, that's Paddy Pimblett's best win. Paddy Pimblett, despite his skills and potential, is by far the most untested fighter of this group. And while he also has the most, let's say, personal history with Ilia Topuria, following their fallout and their clash and a lot of the shit talking they do back and forth, but that's not enough to warrant a title opportunity. The performance against the quality of opponents has not aligned. The performance has been getting better. His performances have been getting more and more dominant. However, that's not been against the caliber of opponent that's been faced by somebody with the history of Justin Gaethje or even just Armin Sarukian's last 3 fights. Paddy Pimblett has never fought an opponent on the level of an Armin Sarukian, on the level of a Charles Oliveira, on the level of, to be honest, I'd argue that Michael Chandler isn't even on the level of a Beneil Dariush. So I don't think that warrants a title opportunity on his part either. And Armin, despite his inactivity for over a year now, still, he ended up finally stepping in the cage, and he showed a skill set that demonstrated why he was the rightful number one contender. This should have been the announcement of him against Ilia. But luck isn't on Armin's side. When we look at what that recent announcement by Ilya Topuria, which he highlights and suggests that he won't be competing for the first period of the year, understandable. With a lot of the rumors of the personal issues with the divorce from his wife and the potential battle for custody of his children, completely understandable why he would not be engaging in competition at this point in time. But my solution isn't the same solution that the UFC went to, or at least not in its entirety. The UFC just announced yesterday that we will be now going in the direction of an interim title between Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje. If we are going to be fair, we have to completely call out the nonsensical nature of this scheduling. When we look at what Armin Sarukin is being punished for, he's being punished by the UFC and Dana White because he ruined an event when he was given an opportunity that he cried for a long time, and when he had that immediate opportunity, he didn't take it. Okay, then. Justin Gaethje, who's had a longer and much more decorated history and a stronger connection with the UFC, yeah, he's warranted a lot more, and Paddy Pimblett is a surging contender in his own right. So those two on paper, it might look at first glance that it makes sense, but if we put Paddy Pimblett as a prospect who's made it up to this ranking aside, we now have Justin Gaethje, a fighter that's quite literally threatened the UFC to retire if he didn't get a title opportunity. Somebody who's already had two title opportunities and failed both. He failed his opportunity against Habib. He failed his opportunity against Oliveira. He now won the interim title against Poirier. We know that it was the BMF belt, but we knew that that was basically the number one contender fight, if that's accurate. So he won the number one contendership, gambled it, and lost the gamble. Now he's the one making the most absurdity demands. He's the one who's requiring that if they don't abide by his rule, he's going to retire. And the UFC actually succumbed to that. The UFC has a big issue when it comes to some of their favorites in the biases that they play. This has now put everybody in a bit of a weird situation where now we're going to stall the division. And this seems to be a theme with Topuria up to this point. It appears as if every time Topuria is the champion of a division, he stalls out the rightful next fighter. I don't like saying that, especially with considering the situation that he's in, but this is something that he did in featherweight when he was the champion and he didn't engage with Masvar, and he didn't try to get that rematch with Volkanovski, and he didn't challenge Diego Lopez. Like, he very much stalled out that division until he decided that, you know what, I'm just going to throw it away, I'm just going to move up. That doesn't feel very appropriate. And yeah, he defended against Max Holloway. We'll give him credit for that. But once again, there was a very long stalling period that happened from him winning the belt to him announcing his decision to relinquish then go up. Very similar to what happened with John Jones when he defeated Stipe after coming back from that injury. He had a very long decision period of what he wanted to do. It wasn't as egregious. Don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near as egregious as what John Jones did, but the point still stands where it's Topuria seems to constantly be in these situations where he's a bit slow on the uptake. I respect how this time he said the UFC will make their decisions, and I think the decision the UFC should make is a vacant title. Topuria, being in the position he is, should be treated similarly to what happened with Jamal Hill and Yuri Prohaska when they were both injured. For this time period, focus on your family issues, your personal well-being, your health. get all of that, consolidate it, get it together, and come back and fight back for your belt if you're able to. In the meantime, we cannot keep stalling these divisions and stalling these deserving contenders. We should vacate the belt from Ilya Topuria, and then the winner of Justin Gaethje versus Paddy Pimblett, that will now be the interim title holder, should battle Armin Sarukian, who is considered by most fans to be the official deserving number one contender. And that fight would be highly anticipated. It would still be worthy of the US Whiteout card in and of itself. It would give Topuria the time he needs to actually settle himself and decide how he wants to continue progressing his career. It would continue allowing the division to progress and stall, and would give all three of the potential contenders for the lightweight division an opportunity to continue towards their goal of a championship. I also believe it would genuinely be the most fair thing to do for these contenders in this division. Moving on, we have the welterweight division. This one's a lot easier to discuss, but the reason why this is a conversation where I feel like it needs to be had in depth as well is because of the recent announcements by the UFC. When you consider somebody like Lerone Murphy, who a lot of us considered to be one of the two most deserving contenders alongside Mavzar Evloev, and they both were overlooked for Diego Lopez for nothing other than popularity. When we look at this, and then we look at someone like Ian Machado Gary, who he has had the toughest test and is the most active of all the contenders currently. When we look at the other two contenders for a chance at Islam Makhachev, who is now the current welterweight division champion, we look at the fact that we had somebody like Carlos Prates, who's already been defeated by Ian Gary. And then we have somebody like Michael Morales, who, kind of similar to Paddy Pimblett, is the most untested of the group. However, he's also, just like Paddy Pimblett, the one person who no one has solved this yet. We had Michael Morales just dominate Sean Brady, who was, in a lot of people's mind, the number one contender and the next in line outside of Ilya Topuria himself as a potential firefight. But we saw that Michael Morales dominated Brady and took that spot. The difference is Ian Machado Gary has the better resume, and we all can agree to it. And the reason why Sean Brady was considered by a lot of people to be the number one contender, or at least one of the potential number one contenders alongside Machado Gary, because Brady also was fairly active and also was taking on a lot of tests, and it also had only been solved once. We look at Ian's history, and he got solved by Shavkat Rakhmonov. A lot of people consider Shavkat to be the person who should have already challenged a title by now, similar to how a lot of people looked at Hamza Chimaev before he ended up getting his opportunity. A lot of people expected Shavkat to have already even earned the title right now, but we saw Shavkat, when he was supposed to face Belal and gain his opportunity, Belal got injured. After Belal got injured, Shavkat got injured. Then Shavkat also had other personal stuff to deal with, and it's led to a very long period of inactivity from him. In that meantime, the welterweight division has constantly progressed, moved, and changed. We've seen Prates, who his biggest challenge up to this part, on paper, should have been Leon Edwards. But we saw him, watched him run through Edwards with no issues. Following Leon Edwards, we've seen Prates more or less conquer every other opponent since he's joined the UFC, with the exception of Ian Gary, who for 4 of those 5 rounds completely outschooled, out-technicaled, outpaced Prates. Made a bit of a mistake in the 5th round, got caught, and still had the wherewithal to survive and get through to the end of the fight. Then we saw Gary end up fighting against Bilal Muhammad. We've watched in this recent UFC Qatar card, we saw a very high level fight where Gary had brick wall takedown defense and had very effective striking. And even when Bilal pushed the pace and clashed in a lot of those firefights, Gary was able to engage and still eventually change it and push his own pace. Very, very high level chess match and great improvements from Gary himself, who we did see get taken down by Shafkat and still was the one who almost got the finish in that fight. Of every single fight we've seen in Gary have, if we're all being fair, he has been very impressive when it comes to the quality of a fighter. He has had constant improvements. He has faced constant tough challenges. He's faced constant amounts of challenges, and he's overcome almost everyone up to this point. We now have Michael Morales, who he is facing the person who lost to the person that Ian Gary just beat. Mind you, Bilal is a better pure wrestler than Sean Brady, while Sean Brady is a better submission threat than Bilal is. When it comes to the pure boxing, Sean Brady has the cleaner looking striking, whereas Bilal has the more effective striking. And we watch Ian Gary conquer Bilal fairly evidently as well. After that, before that, we've watched Ian Gary in these tests. We saw him go against somebody like Michael Venom Page, one of the most elusive strikers in the division. We've seen how easily in and out MVP has gotten both before and after Ian Gary. And once again, another puzzle that was only solved by Ian Gary thus far. When you look at Prates, despite his dynamic knockouts, how can you argue that he is a more deserving contender than the person he literally lost to within his last 3 to 4 fights? Then when it comes to Michael Morales, if we're saying that it isn't definitive that he is a more deserving contender than Prates, and we're even saying things like these two should fight it out to determine the number one contender, then how can we then compare him to Gary, who is significantly more proven, tested, and validated than Prates? Remember, if Islam Makhachev didn't defeat Jack Della Maddalena in this recent fight card 2 weeks ago, then Islam Makhachev would have been an unranked fighter in the welterweight division. JDM would have still been the champion, and Bilal would have been the number 1 ranked fighter. That would have meant that Ian Gary beating him would have made him rank 1. Right now, he's rank 2 because that was Bilal's rank, and JDM being the champion ended up moving down. When you look at the actual division, Ian Gary has the rank, he has the skill set to make it interesting, because even when it goes to skill set wise, with Michael Morales, there's a lot more unknowns, so we don't know how his get-ups are. We don't know if he can defend against Islam Makhachev completely, and we know he has a lot more power, and we know he has incredible speed. That makes it an interesting fight as well. With Carlos Prates, he's a bit worse version of Michael Morales. Good takedown defense, good submission defense, but when we then look at his technical striking, we see the gaps. And we see that even Leon Edwards was able to get a bit of an upper hand in a grappling exchange. And we know Islam Makhachev is on a completely different level than Leon Edwards. So when we look at all these factors, and then we are comparing them all to each other, then it becomes a debate between Michael Morales and Ian Gary. Michael Morales has been significantly less active than Ian Gary. Michael Morales has faced significantly less opposition than Ian Gary. Michael Morales' 2 best wins, as far as quality opponent-wise, have been against Sean Brady and Gilbert Burns. Now, these 2 fighters are incredible fighters, and each of them has proven themselves in multiple aspects. However, when you then compare that against Ian Gary beat Carlos Prates. definitively. I'd argue that right now that's a much better win than a Gilbert Burns win. Then Ian Gary beat Michael Venom Page. Once again, somebody who is running through this division. Then, at the very least, while it can be argued that Michael Venom Page's quality of opponents aren't the best that they could be, but it's looking very impressive and very entertaining on the part of MVP. Then, this most recent performance against Bilal Muhammad, which is beating one of the best fighters in the division, somebody who is more proven than Michael Morales and all his opponents, as well as Carlos Prates and all his opponents. Then when we look at even an opponent that Ian Gary has in common with Geoff Neal, it went in two different ways, where Carlos Prates dominated Neal with overwhelming power, whereas Ian Gary completely outpaced him with overwhelming skill. End up putting it that way. Then we look at Shavkat Rachmanov, who Ian Gary lost to. His only loss in the division, but somebody who was on 100% finish ratio up to that point and almost got finished himself by Ian Gary. Never once was in a position that he was the submission threat, that he was the finishing threat, but he almost got finished and submitted himself by somebody who at that point was still known primarily as a striker. He's still known primarily as a striker, but his jiu-jitsu fundamentals and his submission threat has been constantly improving. We've seen it improve against Michael Venom Page. We saw it improve against Shavkat. And then we've seen that takedown defense significantly improve against Bilal. Every time we see Ian Gary, he's better and better. So when we talk about matchup-wise and interest-wise, it's much more interesting to see him against Islam Makhachev as well. But with all the recent changes that were announced yesterday, and when we look at situations like Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez 2, and the interim title with Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje, and the UFC, even Dana White himself announcing that Ilya is going to fight the winner of the interim title. While that is subject to potentially change, we are in this state of being where we don't know. We don't know what's going to happen next, and these deserving contenders are being overlooked. It then gets it to the point where it's now what the same thing we always say the fans argue that they don't want it to be. They don't want it to be boxing. It is starting to feel a lot more like gimmicks and a show. And I'm not talking that it's also a show, but it feels as if the skill and deserving and earning aspect of the sport is getting smaller and smaller, and it's becoming more and more about just who's the most popular and who do we think we can squeeze the most dollar out of. It's no longer us putting the best of the best and letting them prove themselves and become stars against each other. It's now let's ring everybody out and let's just pick our favorites and push them. While there was always that aspect of the sport, it's just getting worse and worse now. My opinion, we have to set the stage. With the lightweight division, we need to vacate the belt, take the belt from Ilia Topuria, or let him surrender it himself. Whichever one results will be the same. Then we need to wait for this victory. Whoever wins between Gaethje and Pimblett, place them against Armin Sarukian. That will be an exciting fight regardless. Especially because I think Paddy and Armin has a little bit of issues themselves against each other. So there is still that bit of trash talking personal factor. Then we need to give Ian Machado Gary his opportunity against Islam Makhachev. Next up should be Michael Morales versus Carlos Prates. That's where we should get our next opponent for the welterweight division from. And if Ilya decides to come back, you never know how long his situation might take. If he comes back this year, later in the year, Give him his opportunity against whoever the winner of Arman Sarukian versus the winner of Gaethje versus Pimblett is. And then we'll have Islam Makhachev versus the winner of whoever Prates versus Michael Morales is, on the assumption that he doesn't lose to Ian Gary. And then we can still have that super fight at the end of the year with Ilya versus Islam. I know that ends up introducing a lot more risk, and a lot of the fans are very risk averse and don't want to risk that super fight that could potentially happen, especially at the scenery at the White House. But we have to give up on the White House card being the one where it's going to happen. We're just going to have to abandon that hope. However, if Ilia Topuria and Islam Makhachev are as great the fighters as we truly pretend and believe that they are, then they should both be capable of overcoming these trials and tasks, and we should still be able to see them meet at the end. Well, let me know what y'all think, though. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video. I'll see y'all next time. Peace!